Good evening, everyone. I have a confession to make. I really didn't want to record anything at all tonight because I was looking at the news earlier today and it was all so gosh darn depressing. And I was thinking, man, I really don't have a good way to spin this in a positive light, but I'm going to attempt to do so, and we'll see how successful I am at the end of today's video. Now, today I am pre-recording because Andy and I have our marriage group after the fact, so I want to leave right on time and make sure I have plenty of space to get into that because that is very important. I feel like focusing on our families, on our marriages, on our communities is going to be one of the best ways that we can solve a lot of these problems. I often say that part of the reason that people get so disheartened and down about the state of the country as a whole is because they're looking at the whole thing and not at the things that they can control. Unfortunately, that is what happens to a lot of people. That's why people get hung up on presidential elections and politics at the very highest level. I don't think this is the right way to approach it. I think we need to look at the things that we can control. So we're going to kick this off, as I often do, with a slightly off-topic article that's a little more upbeat than some of the rest of them. It's not necessarily news related. This one is about vegetables and fruits for kids. And it says, the core problem of U.S. diets, half of children don't eat a single piece of fruit or vegetables daily, a CDC report finds. And that is terrible. I am very sorry to hear that. This is a third of American children also fail to consume just one piece of fruit a day, but nearly 3 in 5 are having sugary drinks at least once a week. Yeah, I would say it's probably more like once a day. Half of American children under 5 don't eat a single daily vegetable, according to an official report. A third also fail to consume just one piece of fruit a day, yet nearly 3 in 5 have a sugary drink at least once a week. And as far as stuff that we do control, I think that the stuff our kids eat should probably be one of the highest priorities we have. We should be looking for ways to feed our kids grass-fed meat. We should be looking at free-range chickens that are raised humanely, animals that are raised humanely. I really personally don't like the way that American farms are run. They seem very crowded, full of sicknesses, bacteria, lots of antibiotics. Chickens are pumped full of growth stimulants to make them big before they should be. And as a result, we're consuming all of that stuff when we eat, even when we attempt to eat healthy. So here we see, ate one or more pieces of fruit per day. No, 32%. Yes, 68%. Drank one or more sugary drinks per week. No, 49%. That's actually better than I expected. And then ate one or more pieces of vegetable per day. No, 49%. So we really need to prioritize what our kids are eating in order to keep them healthy. And I think this is probably one of the best, most practical ways that we can make sure that we are working with our communities to make sure that the future is bright for our kids. Now, we shouldn't wish for our kids to live easy lives because we are currently seeing the result of easy living when we look around us. It's very discouraging to see how difficult things have become now because of how easy things have been. And it's not a good thing for us to live easy lives. We think that it would make everything a little bit more fun and a little bit easier to live with, but it doesn't. It weakens us. And this is something that I've really been coming to terms with lately because I honestly believe that just like we need fiber in our diet to stimulate our interior workings, we also need difficulty to remind us that we need to struggle in order to keep ourselves in peak condition. Oh, look at this map. This is discouraging. So, proportion of children not eating at least one piece of fruit per day here in Louisiana. Louisiana is terrible as far as dietary stuff goes. They have truly awful, Louisiana and Mississippi are a couple of the worst states for health and obesity rates pretty much anywhere in the U.S. Now, this state up here is good. I don't remember which one that is. So here's, I see Massachusetts, New York. I think that's not New Hampshire. It's New Hampshire. That might actually be Vermont, but I'm not sure. My grasp of geography without labels is challenging at best. And here are children not eating at least one portion of vegetables per day. Terrible, terrible. And then sugary laden drinks. It's so easy to give your kid a juice and just say, take it away. But this is one of the small ways that we can take control of our environment immediately around us and make the world better actively. Like in 5 minutes, go out and get some carrot sticks and you can serve them with some ranch. And you can steam them in the microwave for about 5 minutes. You can sprinkle them maybe with some kind of seasoning to make them interesting. I really feel like the more I learn about human nature, the more convinced I am that in order to achieve something worthwhile, it has to be somewhat difficult. And you have to put in the work to make sure that you are figuring out the best way to do it and then sustaining that as you go forward. And that's one simple way that we can kind of make the world around us better. By eating our vegetables ourselves, if we have kids, by being a good role model, and then by also encouraging and requiring our kids to do the same. So let's start with this story because it's kind of a good story. Definitely not what I expected from the New York Times. This is from the Post-Millennial. The New York Times punches back after Hollywood celebrities GLAAD slam reporting on trans medical treatment. So if you guys missed this, a bunch of celebrities spoke up in favor of the most persecuted, least vocal minority ever, the trans community, and mentioned that they were being misrepresented, they were being targeted by anti-trans groups, etc. Here's how the New York Times punched back. The LGBTQ community and our allies have had enough, and we demand the New York Times take action. GLAAD professed. Ridiculous. They also parked a truck outside their building, saying for more than a year, the New York Times science desk has undermined support for trans youth by questioning medically approved best practice healthcare. Yes, you absolutely should question all of this. And if the New York Times were actually a journalistic outlet, because they are not innocent of all of this thinking, if they were actually a good journalistic outlet, this would be what they did all the time. They would question both sides of the aisle relentlessly. They would be constantly in pursuit of the truth. Thankfully, they have been pushing it against the trans agenda, you could call it, in the past, and I'm very happy to see it. GLAAD has launched a campaign to excoriate the New York Times for their surprisingly mostly objective reporting on the trans craze that's sweeping the Western world. But the Times, to their credit, stands by their reporting. Anyone who understands that there are differences between men and women and that biological sex is an immutable condition has been pleasantly surprised to see the almost unbiased coverage of the divisive issue in the New York Times of late. Yeah, if you guys remember, a while ago we covered a piece they did about trans kids, and they raised questions about whether puberty blockers were a good idea for kids, and I was very happy to see it. I remember being very impressed. But for those beholden to the gender cult who have cast their allegiance entirely to gender ideology, the tone of the Times has been nothing short of transphobic and hateful. So reads an open letter to the Times, signed by a long list of Times contributors and advocates for the trans cause, and published by GLAAD. Another letter was sent to back up the first letter, and the whole thing is part of an anti-NYT campaign launched by GLAAD. Among those who signed the letters are Hollywood celebs Gabrielle Union, Judd Apatow, Tommy Dorfman, Lena Dunham, Joey Soloway, Margaret Cho, Jonathan Van Ness, and Wilson Cruz, among others. Disney-backed GLSEN, along with the Human Rights Campaign, National Black Justice Coalition, Women's March, National LGBTQ Task Force, PFLAG National, the Transgender Law Center, and Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, also signed on. GLAAD also posted billboards outside the Times offices in New York, which state essentially that the Times coverage of views questioning trans treatment is questioning trans people's right to exist and access medical care. The demand is that the Times, quote, stop. Ridiculous. No one is questioning that trans people exist. We are questioning if it is a good idea to harm them before they are of the age of majority and in the correct position to make these choices about their own bodies. We have had enough, GLAAD President and CEO Sarah K. Ellis said. The Times' inaccurate, biased coverage has been cited in legal documents used to justify discrimination and targeting of trans people. This is chilling, and it should give every reader and every leader of the New York Times pause. It's time for the Times to stop this relentless misinformation disguised as disingenuous, just asking questions reporting and ridiculous and harmful opinion pieces that do not represent the reality of trans people's experiences. The letter takes issues with the Times coverage of parental rights in cases where schools have allowed students to socially transition to the opposite sex at school, and investigations into the horrifying and life-destroying side effects of drugs and surgeries used to force a body to present more as the opposite sex than as the natal one. The letter claims that a woman who underwent a double mastectomy in service to the idea that she was actually a man and came to nearly instantly regret it is simply a member of the anti-trans hate group instead of a woman who has been butchered due to medical lies. A complaint made by many who have undergone transition only to be spit out the other side with irreparable harm done to body and mind is that the trans community that once embraced them turns on them and vilifies them for having left the fold. This letter does that by targeting Grace Ladinsky Smith. As thinkers, the letter states, we are disappointed to see the New York Times follow the lead of far-right hate groups in presenting gender diversity as a new controversy warranting new punitive legislation. Puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, and gender-affirming surgeries have been standard forms of care for cis and trans people alike for decades. That's a lie. That's a lie. And we have certainly never given people as young as we are now cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers. That standard has come under question by the very nations that set it and furthered it. The standard is now up for debate in medical circles as a 4,000% increase in girls identifying as boys has sent shockwaves through communities where girls en masse identify as the opposite sex and seek to transition together. Much like a gaggle of girls at a high school dance all head off to the bathroom together. Puberty blockers lead to bone loss, and while the drugs are purportedly intended to be a pause where a kid can figure out if they really want to transition, studies of youth who opt for this course of treatment show that once a child is set on the path of gender transition, they seldom stray from the course, in part due to the social pressure to continue. AbbVie, maker of the puberty-blocking drug Lupron, has said outright that no one should be on the drug for more than 3 months, yet many trans kids stay on it for years. Puberty blockers, by definition, must be prescribed prior to the onset of puberty, which means that a child who starts on these drugs does so before they even have a chance to understand what adulthood in their natal sex might be like. Puberty is a cure for gender dysphoria, but many of these activists who seek to prop up their ideology, they'd rather see generations of kids never grow up naturally than to question the medical science behind interfering with a child's natural development. It is very clear to me that the people behind these kinds of letters, GLAAD specifically, are ideologically possessed, and they strike me as nothing more than Marxist actors who seek to exercise control over very young children. Now, I also wanted to point out, in the past we mentioned the case of the St. Louis Gender Clinic, from which Jamie Reed left and turned around and wrote her excoriating letter about everything they were doing to kids over there. There is breaking news from that center. Doctors from the St. Louis Transgender Clinic told teachers to affirm an entire group of 5th graders despite fears that they were being influenced by their friends. This is exactly what Libby was talking about in the Post-Millennial article. They were not carefully advised to make the correct medical choice for themselves as an individual. They are counseled as entire groups because if they counsel groups together, especially of impressionable young girls who are already in the mindset that they're trying to do what their peers are doing, they're much more likely to subscribe to these ideas and then continue to need medical care, possibly for the rest of their lives. Doctors from the St. Louis Gender Clinic, now under investigation following a bombshell whistleblower claims, advised teachers to affirm an entire group of 5th graders, emails have revealed. The Washington University Transgender Center and the St. Louis Children's Hospital was shamed last week by whistleblower Jamie Reed, a former employee who wrote a bombshell article for the Free Press describing the medically and morally appalling scenario at play. Her claims sparked 2 investigations, one by the Missouri AG's office and another by the office of Senator Josh Hawley. Misspelled here. Come on, Daily Mail, get a copy editor. Hawley. Now, dailymail.com can reveal the clinic's emails to a concerned elementary school teacher from Parkway Schools, a district on the outskirts of St. Louis. The teacher contacted doctors in October 2021 seeking help when a group of 5th graders, girls aged 10 or 11, claimed they were all transgender. Let's see what this says. Hi, Blank. I hope you've been well. I wondered if I can ask you a quick question about a situation we're experiencing at one of our elementary schools. The short story is that one of the students in the 5th grade class is coming out as trans. She's told several of her friends, and now several of them are also saying they're trans. We do not want to discourage them if this is the case, but we're also suspecting there could be other reasons they're doing this than that it is actually the case. Is this common? Are there resources for handling this type of situation? Again, we do not want to discourage kids if this is actually the case, but we also don't want to diminish the actual experience of trans folks. I hope this makes sense. Any resources you can point me toward would be greatly appreciated. Also, I copied the counselor for the 5th grade students at this school. Yeah, so let's see. Hi, Blank. I'm glad you reached out. I am happy to provide some guidance. I may get a little long-winded in this email, so I apologize for that, as this particular topic has become very conversation-generating, to be diplomatic. Depending on who you ask, this is common, but also in varied ways. There are schools of thought that have documented this as an issue of significance, in that a student coming out as transgender becomes a contagion. This language isn't affirming, and the few students on phenomenon are, in my personal and professional experience, invalid. The other end of the spectrum is that this is normal in that when one person realizes who they are and shares it, others realize they are similar. I believe there is a middle ground where we allow for some nuance. If younger folks, and some adults too, it is easy to latch on to the new concept or idea and make it your own. This happens in some areas as adults: fad diets, workout types, multi-level marketing plans, product loyalty, etc. So it's not abnormal for young person either. I have seen this happen with mental health diagnoses as well. You have ADHD? Me too. However, it may still be a valid experience, and for some, it may be a genuine exploration of gender. I will try to find some resources for you after filtering through resources that may invalidate transgender folks. In general, I'd recommend as much support and discussion as possible around this gender exploration. That was a little wordy. Let me know what follow-up questions you may have. A staff member from the clinic replied, telling the teacher that studies which suggest social contagions are invalid and that they would recommend as much support and discussion as possible around their gender exploration. Of course they did. This is Dr. Sarah Garwood. She advised the best we can do is affirm, validate, and allow for exploration. So these people are fully unwilling to accept that it might be a social contagion, which is exactly the premise of Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. All right, so they're explaining what was said. The doctor then compared it to fad diets, workout types, etc. Right, so we read that whole thing. However, it may still be a valid experience. Let's see here. The emails were released as a result of a Freedom of Information request filed by Parents Defending Education. Nikki Niley, the president and founder of the group, told DailyMail.com the utter lack of curiosity about the underlying causes of such a trend among 10-year-old children by medical professionals is immoral at best and an abdication of professional responsibility at worst. These children and their families have been let down both by the school and the hospital, so it's a little wonder that trust in these institutions have declined precipitously over the past few years. She's entirely correct. The clinic is now under investigation from the Missouri AG's office and Senator Josh Hawley's office. None of its staff members have commented on the controversy. Of course they haven't. Why would they? But they will be held accountable. I'm very optimistic because of what Josh Hawley has said lately. Hopefully he's truly willing to hold them to account, because this is genuinely scandalous, and I feel like if they're not held accountable, then no one ever will be, because it was such a clear-cut case with their whistleblower there, Jamie Reed, coming out and putting her name and her reputation and everything on the line because she thought that was the right thing to do. Honestly, good for her. More power to her. So they have everything they need to really hold these people accountable, and hopefully that's exactly what they do. Now, speaking of holding people accountable, this is from East Palestine, the city in Ohio that was subject to that horrific disaster when that train derailed that was carrying such crazy chemicals. You're on your own, East Palestine. Residents are told they're ineligible for FEMA help because their homes weren't destroyed by toxic train derailment, as many ask, Where's Pete Buttigieg? And Biden stays silent 2 weeks into the disaster. Yeah, I was just thinking about this. I was like, where is President Biden on the topic of what happened in Ohio? He's nowhere to be seen. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine says he's asked FEMA for help but was turned down. Pete Buttigieg has not visited East Palestine or given any assurances to the town. And President Biden is yet to comment on the disaster, which began on February 3rd. This is frankly disgusting to me, and it's infuriating. It makes me think that the Biden administration hates the people who live in Middle America, thinks nothing of them, finds them completely unimportant, completely irrelevant, and not worth any time. We're willing to give almost unlimited funds to Ukraine, but we can't even bring ourselves to get FEMA help for a part of the country that is so strongly affected by such a ridiculous disaster. Let's see what DeWine says. I spoke with the White House earlier this morning to address the need for federal help in East Palestine. As a result of this conversation, I have requested assistance from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Health and Emergency Response Team, and CDC to provide direct support. The DeWine administration has been in daily contact with FEMA to discuss the need for federal support, but FEMA continues to advise Ohio is not eligible for assistance at this time. I will continue working with FEMA to determine what assistance can be provided. This is disgusting. While FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, isn't offering any funds, the CDC and Department of Health and Human Services have been drafted in. CDC's team will track whether there are any clusters of illnesses on the ground that may be related to the derailment, while the HHS team will provide additional healthcare staff according to the governor's office. The Ohio National Guard and the U.S. EPA is also helping. I'm assuming that means the EPA, United States Environmental Protection Agency. But there has been a notable lack of support from President Biden himself and Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg. The lack of federal support is tormenting residents in the town, who last night demanded to know why Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg didn't attend a town meeting about the crisis. Where's Pete Buttigieg? Where's he at? One man asked. An exasperated Mayor Trent Conway replied, I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. President Biden is yet to comment on the disaster, which began on February 3rd when a Norfolk Southern train carrying vinyl chloride and other hazardous materials derailed. The president underwent a physical exam on Walter Reed this afternoon and is due back at the White House shortly, where he's scheduled to give a media briefing on unexplained UFOs that were shot down over the weekend. This is way more important than whatever unidentified flying objects were over the U.S. The White House has told us they don't think they're from China. They don't think they're actually UFOs. They don't think there's any aliens involved, but they are fully and patently unwilling to discuss what happened in Palestine, which is no joke whatsoever. I'm genuinely concerned about people really getting sick as a result of this, because people are reporting that their pets are dying, wildlife is dying, fish are belly up. Yeah, so here we go. Here's East Palestine, and then here's train tracks on the edge of town. Death possible here in the middle, and then injury possible. And there is, what's it called? I think it's called phosgene. Yeah, phosgene causes breathing difficulties and was actually one of the biological weapons used during World War I. Absolutely crazy. Oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. Yesterday, Mayor Conaway said the first he'd heard from anyone in Washington, D.C. was on Thursday, more than 10 days after the derailment. Part of the town was evacuated over environmental concerns, and officials then decided to burn the hazardous materials in a controlled setting to avoid an unplanned deadly explosion. Now residents don't know whether it's safe to return to their homes. They're being told that there are no traces of the toxic chemicals in the water or air, but have been advised to drink bottled water as a precaution. Many have rejected those assurances, including Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. If the EPA administrator wants to start here and tell people that the tap water is safe, they should be willing to drink it. If I were living here, I'd be drinking bottled water. Many residents continue to complain of sore eyes and scratchy throats, and some say they're suffering headaches. There are grave concerns for the health of the town's residents and mounting questions over the crisis. Republican Senator J.D. Vance said on Thursday that the EPA administrator ought to drink the tap water if Norfolk Southern CEO is yet to visit the town as well. I heard they canceled a conference with town people, which is not surprising. He's joined in his absence by Buttigieg, whose few public remarks about the incident have included an attempt to blame the fiasco on the Trump administration. That's really classy. And they go on to say the Trump administration repealed a safety rule requiring new electronic brakes and made its trains dangerously long. Buttigieg has been widely panned for his poor handling of the crisis. On the topic of the Biden administration, Biden says there is no evidence 3 shot-down UFOs were Chinese and were likely from, quote, private companies, and tells reporter, give me a break, when asked if he's compromised by family business in China. Anytime Joe Biden says, give me a break, you know that he is, in fact, lying. And when he refuses to answer a question like that, the answer to the question is the one that makes him most uncomfortable. So yes, he's 100% compromised by China. I think you can safely gather from his response to this. Biden addressed the nation on Thursday after 4 objects had been shot down. He promised sharper rules for dealing with unidentified objects in U.S. airspace. He said 3 objects likely belonged to private companies, not spy agencies. Okay, not sure how he gathered that. We don't know exactly what these 3 objects were, but nothing right now suggests they were related to China's spy balloon program or they were surveillance vehicles from any other country. The intelligence community's current assessment is that these 3 objects were most likely balloons tied to private companies, recreation, or research institutions studying weather or conducting other scientific research. Ridiculous. Biden came under intense criticism for allowing the balloon to fly across the U.S. before giving the order to shoot it down once it was off the coast of South Carolina on February 4th. 3 further mystery craft have been shot down since the first balloon was spotted. Biden had been criticized ever since for not addressing the nation at the time when warplanes were being scrambled to intercept mysterious aerial invaders. On Thursday, he defended waiting to take down the spy balloon. Because we knew its path, we were able to protect sensitive sites against collection, he said. We waited until it was safely over water, which would not only protect civilians, but also enable us to recover substantial components for further analysis. Ridiculous. And then we shot it down, blah, blah, blah. I want to see where he talked to that reporter about being compromised by China. The result is growing suspicion that the first balloon tapped into paranoia about China, leading it to trigger happy response once officials released their scrutiny of the skies. The president said he planned to speak to Chinese leader. The way they're writing these articles doesn't make sense. I apologize, guys. He said the aim was a system that would help distinguish between objects that pose safety or security risk and those that do not. Make no mistakes, if any object presents a threat to the safety and security of the American people, I'll take it down. Defense officials gave lawmakers classified briefings on Capitol Hill this week. So, increasingly incompetent, no one trusts them, no one believes what they say. Now, I don't think we're going to cover this one, but I did want to mention this case of the Scottish politician who recently retired for being too woke. This is an opinion piece from Niall Gardner. This says, sending a rapist to a woman's jail cost Scotland's ultra-woke, trans-obsessed premier her job. At last, a wake-up call to our politicians. Abandon common sense at your own peril. Niles Gardner is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. What could America's woke progressives possibly learn from a Scottish separatists an ocean away? A hell of a lot. Scotland's far-left, ultra-woke First Minister Nicola Sturgeon of the Scottish National Party, SNP, largely voted for by women, I will point out, has been running that country for nearly a decade until Wednesday when she resigned. Sturgeon was not forced from office by personal scandal or a determined opposition. No, her political comeuppance was self-inflicted. She sacrificed herself, her party, and their cause on the altar of wokeism. Take notice, Joe Biden. On December 2022, Sturgeon's government passed a bill to allow anyone over the age of 16 to self-identify as the opposite sex without a medical diagnosis. The public outcry caught the government by surprise. British feminists on the right and left pointed out the obvious. Allowing men who identified as women into female-only spaces like changing rooms and shelters fundamentally threatened the safety of women and children in Scotland. Famous author J.K. Rowling courageously stood up against the extremist transgender agenda, and she was condemned as a bigot for it. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak vetoed Sturgeon's gender recognition bill, but still Sturgeon pushed it forward, even as other critical aspects of Scottish life suffered. Education, a top priority for Sturgeon, deteriorated. As her term ends, the achievement gap between rich and poor children is wider than it was before the COVID pandemic. Not surprising at all. There are record wait times for government healthcare, illicit drug deaths are spiraling out of control, and businesses have been crippled by years of high taxes, new regulations, and low growth. It was in this environment of declining standards of living and rising strife that the case of rapist Adam Graham exploded. Graham was accused of preying on 2 women he met online. Yet after his trial began, he began to transition away from a man to a transgender woman. In 2023, Graham, 31, now identified as Isla Bryson, was convicted and remained remanded to Scotland's only exclusively female jail to await sentencing. Women's groups already outraged over the gender bill demanded to know why the Scottish prison system would transfer a convicted rapist of women to a women's prison. Even Bryson's estranged wife told DailyMail.com sending him to a women's prison is outrageous. Will one of the vulnerable women inmates be the next victim to be attacked by him? He won't stop. It's in his nature. Bryson was later transferred to a men's facility, but the SNP later found herself in the awkward position of refusing to say whether Bryson was a woman, as Bryson self-identified, or a man. The ridiculous debate played out on the Parliament for weeks, as Sturgeon ducked and weaved around any acknowledgement of Bryson's preferred pronouns and biological gender. The First Minister says she doesn't have enough information to decide if this double rapist is a man, Sturgeon's questioner prodded this month. Bryson, after all, has male genitalia. Here we see Bryson. What further information can the First Minister possibly need? Sturgeon answered, the individual we're talking about has identified as a woman. You see, to Sturgeon and woke ideologues, biology is inconsequential. If an individual feels like a woman, voila, they're a woman. Ordinary Scots and even SNP members balked at the real-world applications of Sturgeon's woke vision, and in a country still reeling from the pandemic, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. In 2023, Graham, 31, now identifying as Isla Bryson, above, was convicted and remanded to Scotland's only exclusively female jail to await sentencing. And this is Graham before his transition. Public approval for the government plummeted, and the cause of Scottish independence, the central mission of the SNP, was set back a generation, if not more. Sturgeon had become the face of her party's failure to address the real concerns of her constituents while pursuing the fringe causes of the extreme left. She had to step down. America's gender-obsessed woke should be watching this in horror because their policies are not so different. Demi Minor, formerly Demetrius, is a transgender inmate of New Jersey's prison system, who was convicted of stabbing her foster father to death. Demi was incarcerated in New Jersey's only women's prison in accordance with the Democratic-run state's gender self-ID policy. In June, it was discovered that Demi had impregnated 2 other inmates. Demi has since been moved to a men's prison, but the fate of the children born to parents behind bars remains unclear. That is disgusting. That is such a betrayal of basic human rights to subject women in prison, literally the most vulnerable women in society, to a male sexual predator. Genuinely disgusting, and New Jersey should be ashamed. And the fact that these children exist because wokeism forced them to is disgusting, and I care deeply about each child that exists. The children in this position should never have been put. They should never have been put in this position at all. And there must be a reason that they exist. There must be a plan for their existence for sure. But it is not fair to these women to have children that they never signed up for and never consented to. I understand there is an argument for abortion in the case of rape. I personally do not agree with that. But the fact of the matter is that woke politics put this person in this prison who ended up attacking these women, which resulted in these 2 additional lives. And I can only assume that they're going to go on to do great things, but that's a very difficult hand of cards to be dealt, and really not something that we can take lightly at all. Absolutely disgusting. Anyway, I am just very grossed out by this, but I am so glad that Nicola Sturgeon had to step down over this. She fully deserved it. Honestly, I kind of am respectful of that. I think that's a really important step that she took. But I am not optimistic that any American politicians will follow her example, unfortunately, even though I think they should, for sure. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it here, and then Andy and I are going to go on to our marriage group, and I will see you all tomorrow, hopefully in better spirits and with much better news. Until next time, bye guys.